Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting the session now, so if you wouldn't mind taking your seats. My name's Kate Davis. I'm from the University of Southern Queensland, where I'm a research fellow in the Digital Life Lab, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Peter Leonard. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So let me tell you a little bit about our last keynote speaker for the day. Peter Leonard is the director of the Digital Humanities Lab at Yale University Library. He received a BA in Art History. I didn't know there were any others in the world. I'm one also. From the University of Chicago, and his PhD in Scandinavian Literature from the University of Washington. He came to Yale in 2013 as the first librarian for digital humanities research. Prior to Yale, Peter was responsible for humanities research computing at the University of Chicago and served as a postdoctoral researcher in text mining at UCLA, supported by a Google Digital Humanities Research Award. During 2007 to 2008, he served as a Fulbright Scholar at Uppsala University in Sweden. So please join me in welcoming Peter to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone on the organizing committee, including Roxanne and all the others who I had the pleasure to meet before coming to Australia. This is my first trip to Australia. I'm sure you're tired of Yanks telling you that they're really excited about coming to Australia, but I can say personally, it's really amazing to be here, such an amazing multicultural society, the cultural heritage that I've had the chance to see just by walking around Sydney. I was in the State Library of New South Wales just today during lunch. It's been really amazing, really so happy and thankful to take this opportunity to come here. And I did want to talk today about the question of machine vision and human gaze, and really that's just kind of a catchphrase for two things that are kind of colliding. We're having the deep learning part of artificial intelligence come in contact with some of the cultural heritage collections that many of the folks in this room have curated, preserved, acquired, explained, worked with every day for years and years. And so it's that notion of how we negotiate this current moment when cultural heritage is connecting with artificial intelligence in new ways that I wanted to sort of talk to you about some experiments we've been doing in that area at Yale. I do work for Yale University Library. We like to think of the library as the heart of the university. It's a large place, so we have 500 employees. That's significantly larger than a lot of American research libraries. We have a lot of books, and we have 15 buildings across the campus, give or take a few, but the library that's on the screen presently is probably the library that most people associate with the organization, in addition to the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscript Library, which is a modernist building. This most assuredly is not. It is a sort of Gothic palace, Sterling Memorial Library, and we were so excited when our university librarian told us a couple of years ago, good news, you are getting a room in Sterling Memorial Library for the Digital Humanities Lab. And we thought, this is amazing, thank you so much, and then she told us what room it was. And so this is the original reserve book reading room in Sterling Memorial Library, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. This is, of course, a fantasy of Tudor England. This is the early English Renaissance. But like the rest of the building, it was completed in the 20th century. It's a 1930s building. So in the States, stuff is oftentimes a lot younger than you might think. So over the last 18 months, we've been working on a massive renovation and construction project that tries to respect the fabric and the materiality and the space of the original reserve book reading room in Sterling Memorial Library and turn it into a modern space for digital scholarship and turn it into what we call the Franke Family Digital Humanities Lab. We just opened in October, and this is an image of some folks working in our room. You can see we've kept the bookshelves. We have the books facing out now. That's kind of very au courant, so people can see the covers. We have digital screens. We have a special projects cube made out of glass in the middle of the room. So that's the space in which a lot of the projects I'm going to be showing you today take place. We are a service for Yale scholars. We try to help undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty members. We try to help librarians and curators. We're, as I mentioned, physically and organizationally a part of Yale Library. But we really are optimized for humanists, for literature, art, history. We are optimized for those disciplines for whom quantitative and algorithmic is not a natural part of graduate training. It was not part of my training in literature. And we think of ourselves as a complement to traditional library services, to the world-class physical holdings at Yale, as well as the world-class subject expertise in our subject selectors. We often get asked the question, what is the digital humanities? My boss asks me that all the time, and so we have a website in which we try to talk about some of the work that we do, and we sometimes break this digital humanities work down into text analysis, which is really my thing. I came from a world of text mining. We also have geospatial, GIS stuff in the bottom left. We have network analysis with nodes and edges in the bottom right. And it's actually the top right that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about visual analysis, visual culture computation. And in my abstract, I said, I basically said 2 sentences. I said, what can artificial intelligence offer GLAM professionals to sort of serve what their goals are, which is to increase access and to facilitate research? I'm sure there's many other goals. But then at the same time, when we think of what it can offer us, what machine learning and deep learning algorithms can offer us, we have to ask, what questions do we have to confront as librarians and curators and other GLAM professionals, not the least of which are our administrative team? What do we have to confront when our archive becomes a data set, whether our own data set or somebody else's data set? And so with that in mind, I think I want to get at that answer by thinking about the problem of, or the opportunity of, collection scale analysis. When I was trained as a literature person, I read a couple dozen books, right? And I read them very slowly and very carefully, but we have 15 million volumes in Sterling Library. Similarly, we have art museums on campus in which there's generations and decades of art historians looking carefully at oil paintings and photographs and indigenous art and all sorts of things. But if you add all those collections up, we're in the tens or the hundreds of thousands of objects, and they're increasingly being digitized and available from all over the world in places like Trove and Europeana. So the question that I'm interested in is, what can machine learning, what can artificial vision systems offer us for the potentiality not to compete with the tradition of close reading, close looking, but what can it enable that's completely new and that operates on the scale of a collection rather than a couple objects in front of the researcher? Because I think the humanists and the historians and others have a good handle on how to do that close reading. What we need help with is thinking about at the scale of a collection. So with that in mind, if we move towards collection scale analysis, I'm going to show you 4 experiments in machine vision on top of cultural heritage that we've been conducting at Yale over the last couple of years. And the first one is actually kind of interesting because it was inspired by an effort here in Australia. So the first experiment I like to talk about is, can a part of an image stand in for a whole? Maybe the image itself, maybe an archive that the image represents. And the project that inspired us to think about this possibility was actually the Real Face of White Australia, which is part of the Invisible Australians project produced by Kate Bagnall and Tim Sherratt. And I have to tell you guys that I talk about the Real Face of White Australia all the time to folks in Europe and to folks in America, because I think it's an incredibly important intervention. It's something that I sometimes struggle to think about what it is. Is it an artwork? Is it an archival interface? Is it a kind of provocation? And maybe all of those things. And I'm sure most of you in the room have seen it, but just in case, I'll bring this up and we can take a look at it in a web browser. So the notion here is that we have a state archive, which has been represented in a kind of indexical way by the face of a photograph. And what's interesting here is that there is technology, there is machine vision that is looking for a face and clipping that face and making it serve as the indexical relationship, the sort of signifier of this archive. I can actually go through and look at the original underlying document here. But what's interesting is the way that this offers a kind of way of, it does many things at once. It confronts you with a title of Faces of White Australia, but it confronts us with what I think most of us would interpret as non-white faces. It confronts us with the state archive, an apparatus of security. It confronts us with questions about citizenship and belonging. But it really sort of focuses on that part of the image which humans love to interpret, which is the human face. And I thought it was really inspirational for us to think about what does the face do and what does it allow us to think about in the context of the archive. So based on that, there was an existing project at Yale that existed before I got to Yale. It was called it's basically the New Deal photography. It wasn't part of the Works Progress Administration, but during the Great Depression, there was a similar agency, originally called the Farm Security Administration, but evolved into the Office of War Information. And they set photographers out across the United States to capture probably 170,000 images over the course of a decade. And this work was basically stewarded by the Library of Congress, but researchers at Yale mapped all of the images, which had never been done before, so we can see the broad patterns in how people photographed the country. Each color of a dot represents a different photographer. We can lay in a historic base map and take a look at these, and we can also zoom in and say, well, show me the particular pictures that Jack Delano took in this part of Kansas, and I can go in there and see it. It's a great interface. But what I can't do in this interface is I can't show you anything about the visuality of the photographic collection. We have colored dots. If I were to try to make a thumbnail the size of a colored dot, you'd never be able to see what's in that image. So we were inspired to kind of think about, well, what could stand in for the richness of this photographic collection? And we decided to take inspiration from the real face of white Australia and build a kind of face map of Americans between 1935 and 1945. Now, it's important to me to point out that this technique uses face detection, but not face recognition. We make no claims about who these people are. What we do try to do is create an interface in which the human face stands in for a photo. And so we can see that if I zoom into this one, I can see that particular face standing in for a photo, and the same over here. So I have a face extracted as a thumbnail, but that's linked with this particular American Legion person. It's an experimental interface. I think it exists alongside the other systems. It doesn't replace them, but allows you to do some interesting searches. So right now we're looking at all the photographers who were active in this government era. I might try something like Gordon Parks, who's a well-known American photographer. Looks like he mainly photographed on the East Coast of the United States. Let's zoom into Washington, D.C. Everybody loves D.C. It's like the Canberra of America. And what we've got here is a really interesting view of the faces that Gordon Parks took pictures of. Looking at these pictures, either the face itself decontextualized or the humans recontextualized, I think you can make some observations about the populations that Gordon Parks photographed in DC. Gordon Parks himself was an African-American photographer. What we like about this interface is that it lets us kind of humans, with all of our imperfections and our biases, draw our own individual conclusions about whom Gordon Parks photographed, who did Jack Delano photograph, and who did Dorothea Lange photograph. In doing this, we had to confront some questions, and really those questions led to absences. So what you don't see in this is any kind of quantification of the sort of putative age or gender or race of any of these Americans. We did not run that kind of face recognition or detection. And there are some banal reasons, like we think more Americans wore hats in the 1930s, and we're not confident that the recognition models would accommodate that. But we're also, I think there's some more deep-seated concerns that the humanists with whom I work don't really trust these models of racial classification, and really, why should you? I think there's an unwillingness to engage with the full suite of artificial intelligence on top of human faces, because it's kind of it seems just too close to anthropometry or eugenics in some ways. So let the human make the decisions, but use the machine to build the map, I think is how I would summarize it. And with that summary, I kind of want to take a quick interlude between my first example and my other three experiments, just to talk really quickly about how computers see. This is a really fun topic for somebody with a degree in literature, because it involves also math that's way above my head. But I think it actually might be more useful for us all to do this interactively. So what I want you to do is to take your cell phone out, and it really doesn't matter if you have Samsung, Huawei, iPhone, Google Pixel, it really does not matter. But take your phone out and go to your Photos app. And what you need to do is you need to go to your Photos app. You'll probably see like the last couple pictures you took or whatever, but somewhere you're going to find a search button. And it might be at the bottom right on my iPhone. You might have to pull down to get the search field to show up. What I'm going to do on my phone, I'm just going to type the word cat. And it turns out that I have 254 pictures of cats on my phone. Now, some of these are my sister's cats, some of them are my friend's cats. Some cats I don't quite recognize, so I don't know what happened that night. But it's basically given me all the cats. Now, if everything goes right, you should also see pictures of cats on your phone. If you don't, if you can't find the search bar, that's one thing. But if you don't find any pictures of cats, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave the room, because you should all be taking pictures of cats. Now, we're not in a world where this is not Flickr. We haven't gone in and tagged these as cats, right? None of us, in fact, I wouldn't even know how to label a picture on my iPhone. Like, it's not really an affordance. So the question we can all ask is, what's going on, and how does this know that I have 254 cats on my phone? And the answer is it's a convolutional neural network. All of you who were able to get a search to return anything, you could try cars, you could try latte, you could try dog if you're a dog person, all of you have just experienced a convolutional neural network which is used for the purposes of labeling or describing images. Convolutional neural networks took off in 2012. They got very popular because they were able to solve a particular image description challenge called ImageNet. So in 2012, they started solving this problem a lot better than any other algorithm ever had. And convolutional neural networks turn out to work very similarly to how our own human vision system works. What I mean by that is they first see very simple lines, vertical lines, horizontal lines. Then there's another layer in the network, and then maybe that sees slight curves or little patterns. There's layer after layer after layer, and finally the last layer is cat or dog or skateboard or latte, whatever you've taken a picture of in certain categories. And so this layering system actually works very similar, as I mentioned, to how humans see. And convolutions are just passing a certain transformation over an image in like a sliding window. It's making things more blurry, looking for straight lines, looking for curved lines. We really don't know or care how these work because they teach themselves to see with pre-trained categories. We've given it categories of cat, dog, chair, bagel, banana, and it learns what features are important. So it basically solves the featurization problem, which is a standard problem that we don't have in text because we can tokenize, we can turn a sentence or a book into individual words. That's really hard with photographs, so in a sense this is a cheat to solve the featurization problem. So all of you have just seen a convolutional neural network in action. It's either running on your iPhone, or if you use Google Photos, or if you have an Android phone, it probably runs in the cloud, doesn't really matter. You can say, why can't we use these convolutional neural networks for our own cultural heritage material? They were so effective in finding my 254 cat pictures that clearly, if we just ran these on cultural heritage material, all of our images would be expertly described, and we would have the sort of cataloging problem solved. So what could go wrong? Well, this is an image from an archive in your country, and I gave this image to the world's best machine vision system, which is Google Cloud Vision API. And I'm picking on them, but really they're the best. I mean, Amazon has recognition. There's a lot of other companies that offer this at API level. And this is what it believes this object is. It's probably a fashion accessory, but also possibly jewelry, earrings, body jewelry. Well, of course, it's none of the above. And so the problem is if you use a convolutional neural network designed for the modern world, it will find cats, but it will not find anything else which is appropriate to the history of transportation or the convict society in Australia. And this gets even worse in my cultural area where manacles or shackles are associated with slavery of Africans. This actually isn't Google's fault, really. It's not Amazon's fault. You can download all sorts of captioning networks. Obviously, there's one running on your phone. It's not those systems' fault. These off-the-shelf captioning systems are optimized for contemporary images. We take pictures of cats. We take pictures of cats with mobile devices, with cell phones. And they're all, frankly, optimized for monetizable use cases. So if you take a picture of yourself drinking a Diet Coke and upload that to Facebook, I can guarantee you'll get an ad for Diet Pepsi because it's recognizing what you're drinking and trying to sell an ad against you. That's fine. The underlying system isn't necessarily biased, but what is characteristic of the sort of private sector is the training data and the categories that people train for. So when I was talking about this problem with a historian of photography at Yale, Laura Wexler, a senior professor, I told her about this awful situation that a system like this could misinterpret slave shackles or leg irons as jewelry. And what she said to me, she said something very interesting. She said, this really reminds me of Fred Wilson's work in the early 90s at the Baltimore County exhibition that he did, which was called Mining the Museum. Have people heard of Mining the Museum? Some of you guys? It's a really interesting thing. Fred Wilson is an artist, and metalwork is part of Mining the Museum. It's hard to see here, but what he's done is he's juxtaposed the decorative silver, the sort of hammered goblets, and all these things from Baltimore's past in the same museum space as actually a pair of shackles, and titled the resulting juxtaposition metalwork. The reason I'm putting this on the screen is not to suggest any kind of easy connection with what the mistakes, the sort of horrible mistake that Google or any other recognition system makes when it confronts this part of the past, but rather just to say that in this space of cultural heritage and deep learning, we have the possibility for amazing results, we have the possibility for horrific results, we have the possibility for exactly the types of juxtapositions or uncomfortable connections between pieces of metal that normally would never be arrayed in the same space, but were by Fred Wilson in 1992. So with that, let me keep on going and talk a little bit about my second experiment, which basically starts from that first problem of these pre-trained captioning networks are great at finding cats, but they're horrible at understanding the complex history of human culture. And so the question is, can we use the power that is going into these pre-trained networks that companies like Google and Facebook and others are making available for free? It's almost impossible to replicate that power because anybody can train a network, but to make a network work really well, you need amazing amounts of ground truth and source material, and it's companies like Google and Facebook that have that imagery. We don't. So the question is, can we somehow get the power of these pre-trained neural network captioning systems without their final categories? Remember I said that the artificial vision systems resemble a kind of progression of complexity. They start with lines, they go to patterns, they go to colors, and then finally they are able to discern a dog from a cat. Well, what would happen if we stepped back from that final layer, which is kind of like overfit to what people take pictures of on their phones? And so what we wanted to do was experiment with this idea on a Civil War collection, on a large private collection of photography that's called the Meserve-Kuhnhardt Collection. It was stewarded and put together by a private family for generations. It's often thought of in this country, in my country, as an archive of images of Lincoln, but as I'm showing you the images on the screen, it's far more diverse than that. It really spans from the American Civil War in the 1860s until the Gilded Age of the 1890s, and it's been acquired by the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It's in the process of being comprehensively digitized. What I'm showing you is a kind of a sneak peek. But here's the problem with the Meserve-Kuhnhardt collection. There are absolutely no cats. I've looked through the entire thing, and so there's very little that would really lend itself to these captioning systems as they exist now. So what we wanted to do was to do an experiment that we've termed Neural Neighbors, which is a focus on pictorial tropes in the Meserve-Kuhnhardt collection. And the idea here is really simple. We take, in this case, Google's freely available pre-trained captioning network, which goes by the name of Inception. It is designed to solve the ImageNet challenge. And what's interesting about it is we discard the last layer. We ignore the notion of skateboard or cat or dog. We take the penultimate layer. Now, the penultimate layer is a pretty complex layer. It's way more complex than the very simple lines that these networks first see, but it's way more abstract than the final classification of bagel, dog, banana, stuff like that. It's impossible to describe what that penultimate layer really sees. The best way to talk about it is that it sees in 2,048 different ways that are important from discerning a horse from a dog. So now we have this high-dimensional space. We have a 2,048 dimensional space, and what we want to do is we want to find, for all of my 27,000 images that I have from the Civil War collection, the Meserve-Kuhnhardt collection, what I want to do is I want to take each image and I want to find the nearest neighbor in this high-dimensional space. So we think about X and Y, and then your teacher would do the dotted line for Z, right, going into the board. That's the third dimension, which that's really hard to represent. We'll think about 2,048 dimensions, and think about a 2,048 dimensional space, and each image existing in this high dimensional space. Now, that's almost impossible for a human to really conceptualize of, but it turns out that computers are very good at being able to do this type of math. So what I want to show you now is just a quick demo of what this collection looks like put into such a system. So what I'm showing you now is just random images from the Meserve-Kuhnhardt collection. There's really no significance to these. I'm showing you them randomly. What might be significant is the fact that when I move my mouse over a particular image, like this guy, I get other images which seem kind of similar to that one. And if I move my mouse over this performer here, I'm going to get other people in interesting costumes. My favorite one is the boxer. If I move my mouse over this pugilist, I get other boxers. Now, key thing to remember, we discard all description. We have no captions, we have no tags, we ignore text. We only look at the raster pixels. What I love about this example is that one of the boxers is flipped, right? It's robust to orientation. There's also, fourth from the right, an African-American boxer. The system is more interested in linearity than it is in tone. We do know how some of these people are. It's Johnny Giles, and then there's like Tommy the Dodger, I don't know. But we don't care about their names. We care about the pictorial trope of figuration. We can scroll to other people and see how, people in ovals or something like that, we might get that. We might get women with hair. That would be kind of interesting. Every time I reload the page, I'm going to get a different image. Probably get other houses, yes, other houses, other dudes standing in military uniforms. I often find it's really interesting to look at women because the way that they're depicted is very interesting in their dress. And yes, some of these are probably reprints, but reprints tell you it's working, right? Ways of just having women depicted in portraiture often is very interesting. So that's Neural Neighbors, and it's an effort that we've been undergoing as kind of an alternate interface. Again, this is my favorite example of the pugilist. What did we learn from this? It's an interesting way of surfacing pictorial tropes. It is a purely visual recommendation engine, so it is something that could be used to suggest other things that you've come at in the archive. I think what's exciting about it is that if you start with one image which is compelling to you, you can then see more things and figure out how does this fit into a culture of visual production and circulation in the 19th century. What questions we had to confront when we were building this, I'm not sure this is something that should stand on its own. I think it should be a feature as part of a system of record of our library system. I don't think it should be, it's a fun demo, but I'd love to have this be a part of every image that we present at Yale. The other, some also interesting things about the math, it looks like, due to the way it works, like the most unique image that differs the most from the conventions of 19th century photography would give you the least good results because it stands on its own, right? So that's kind of an interesting problem that this works very well with genre. It doesn't work with sort of novelty or the first thing to ever occur. And it also really wants a large collection. The more thousands of images you dump in here, the better results you get. So if you had 13 images, I would not recommend this system. That's experiment 2, and experiment 3 actually grows out of the second experiment, rather, which is if we have this high dimensional space, if we have this 2048 dimension space that I can't keep track of because I can barely think of X and Y and Z and then 2045 more, and if we're using this kind of system to build a one-to-many relationship, given this boxer, show me everything around him in this cloud of 2048 dimensions, well, that's not really fully exploiting the power of this featurization space that comes from a pre-trained neural network that we're discarding the final captions because they aren't appropriate. What can we do to really more fully exploit the power of this vision system to almost let the data organize itself? So what we want to do is we're working on a software package called Pixplot. And what Pixplot does is it's very similar to the second thing I showed you about the similarity. It does the same thing. We put cultural heritage items through a pre-trained neural network that is designed to caption them with inappropriate terms. We cut off the last layer, take the penultimate layer. We get 2048 ways of seeing that I can't describe to you, but it doesn't matter. Then I have this high dimensional space, and that means I have a dimensionality reduction problem because as much as I'd like to show you a 2048 dimension visualization, my screen is two-dimensional. So dimensionality problems, reduction problems are really interesting. I like to think of them as similar to being if you were the first outsider to visit South Africa and to see the bird of paradise flower. Does everybody know what the bird of paradise looks like? Okay, so you've got to get this thing back to London. You've got to show your friends and your colleagues that there's this crazy flower. It is not going to make it back on the ship. It will wither. So you have to make a choice. You have to sacrifice one of the dimensions and fold it within the leaves of a book. You have to press it flat and dry it. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. You could naively scrunch it in the book, but then when you got to London, people would be like, this doesn't look like anything. If you're smart, you'll consider the contours of the bird of paradise and think about what dimension can I sacrifice? What's the least important dimension? And if I had a bird of paradise, I would decide to sacrifice the width so that I could still see the beak being open. I would lay it flat and then crush it between the leaves of the book. And there are a whole bunch of algorithms that are going to help us make that decision to lose the least important, or more accurately, preserve the most important dimensions when we reduce from either 3 to 2 or 2048 down to 2. The one that people have probably heard most of is principal component analysis. There's a more interesting one recently called TSNE, which stands for T-stochastic neighbor embedding, which is a way of trying to preserve both a global shape as well as local clusters in my resulting visualization. We happen to use a newer one called UMAP, Uniform Manifold Approximation and Projection. This is just a fancy mathematical way of trying to ensure that we do the least violence to the essential shape of an unrepresentable cloud of objects in 2048 dimension. If we do this right, similar objects will appear near each other, But we still have a lot of things. We have like, the demo I'm going to show you is about 31,000 images, and so we have to not write a conventional website. We have to write a website which is authored a little bit more like a 3D game to allow for a performant experience, so you can surf through a lot of images at once. So let me go ahead and just quickly show you what this looks like. And I thought a lot about what data set to use for this demo. I don't know if they know this, but I've taken all the data from the Yale Center for British Art, which is one of our museums on Yale's campus. And what I've done is I've taken about 31,000 images from the Yale Center for British Art, and I've thrown them on the floor in Pixplot, except if I had really thrown them on the floor, they would have landed randomly. And in Pixplot, they haven't. They've landed such that there are particular islands of material in which visual conventions dictate the arrangement of the objects. So here we are kind of in like, this is like caricature of dandy neighborhood here. These are like well-dressed young men. And that's a particular archipelago down there to the left. There are other parts of the collection over here I can zoom into. Oh, these are all these like frontispieces or like memorials, like a very distinctive visual image there in that particular part of the visualization. There are other objects. Someone I'd like to take a look at landscapes. Let's zoom up here. These are all my pictorial landscapes of the natural world. If you want to go, I just got back from the Taronga Zoo, so if I want to relive that experience, I'm going to go over here and see all the animals. It looks like the British were obsessed with hunting foxes or something. There's also horses. So this is the zoo. And then there's kind of unexpected areas. So one of my favorite ones to talk about, which I don't know if I really would have known about before I did this visualization, is this area in the middle, which seems to me to be kind of botanical illustration. Now remember, we're disregarding all captioning, all expert description, so the computer doesn't know that this is 19th century botanical leaves. But there are some characteristics of this particular zone which get everything to come together in this visualization. Again, we are looking at about 31,000 images on the screen at the same time, and you can see these natural clusters of various British genres just appearing there. So it's kind of a fun way to think about the collection. You start to see a lot of interesting aspects of collections. This is supposed to be about collections at scale, collection scale analysis, and so one of the insights I can share with you is that the Yale Center for British Art quite rightly regards frames to be artworks in and of themselves. So here are these frames. What I like is that they're near other images in which the frame is kind of too big. So it's like the image is risking getting overwhelmed by the frame itself. Now remember, this two-dimensional visualization is a result of a reduction from 2048 dimensions, and that accounts for the sort of obscure shape. People love to interpret this stuff. People think of it as constellations. They think of it as kind of an archipelago with islands. But it is a way of actually trying to sort of see all 31,000 images from the Yale Center for British Art at once. And we think that makes it kind of an interesting experiment. Now, it's not only pictorial or painted oil paintings that we can work with. One of my own projects involves the culture of photography in early 20th century Sweden. There was a really important female photographer named Leonard, who was a pioneer in the field. And she died very young, but she trained some of her successors, including Per Bagge and Ida Eckelund. And interestingly enough, some of these photographs from early 20th century Lund had been digitized already, and then a couple years ago, somebody renovated an attic. And as you can see from the headline, renovating the attic, they discovered thousands of glass plates underneath the floor of the attic, and these were pictures by Ida Eckelund. So what we can do is we can take a look at the same idea, the same tool, but just a different data set here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at about 30,000 pictures, 29,000 pictures from early 20th century Lund. These are going to be black and white. And so what we're going to see is similar conventions or similar groupings of folks who all seem similar. I think there's a kind of a military section here. They've all found each other, decided to be there. There's children in chairs, which is kind of a weird genre, but here they are. I'm not sure I would catalog them like that, but the computer sure saw it. Weddings, so this is all wedding photography right there with the veils and the white dresses. Again, a kind of way to sort of jump through. We do have also what I call sort of pictorial art. These are basically pictures of paintings. They're distinctive enough that they show up in this cloud. People often ask about the shape of these things. Remember, it's sort of like a flower you've crushed. So maybe there was one part of the flower shooting off to the left in another dimension that got crushed flat. Well, that's the way to think about Pixplot. It's a way of visualizing enormous collections all at once and letting you kind of consider what things you're interested in pursuing more. What did it offer us? Well, we do think we've produced a truly unique collection scale view. You've seen collections in the 30,000. We have gotten this up to about 80,000. We're rewriting the WebGL shaders. We think we will eventually be able to go to 500,000 or possibly even 1 million objects in your web browser at the same time. I'm really interested in breaking the tyranny of the previous and the next button. Like, I wouldn't want to hit next like 30,000 times to get through a digital library system. This allows you to consider collections at scale. The challenges we face with this really have to do with communicating the contingency of visualization, of communicating to folks that, because something is up and to the left of an object, that doesn't mean it's more up or more left. It's an imaginary space. That there's some stochastic or random aspects of the layout, and so it's not like you can prove that something is on the left and that necessarily means something. But it's certainly a fun project that we've been working on. And the other thing I would say about Pixplot is that despite my kind of extremism here on not looking at textual signal, we know the future is to engage with human curation and expert description. So future versions of the tool are going to allow you to find a cluster of horses that you like and drag a little lasso around it as if you were selecting them in a photo editing program, and then possibly send a tag back to the system to say these are all images of animals. We're also going to allow you to turn on and off parts of the image cloud based on whether something is German or French, or whether it's before or after this year. So we think the visualization gets better once we have metadata in it, but it was important for us kind of philosophically to think about things purely in the visual domain. And this leads me to my last example, which is the notion of neural networks and what they do when they're off duty, because we're asking this NVIDIA hardware and these algorithms and all this crazy stuff to work like for 4 or 5 days in a row to process all our digital cultural heritage in order to find faces, in order to organize them in an imaginary space. And we were kind of curious what happens with all that power when the neural network goes to sleep. Has it been working with our photography or our oil painting so much that it starts to dream or to hallucinate about what it's been working on all that time? And so in order to explore that, we've been playing around with generative models. Now, the generative model that a lot of people have probably heard of is Markov chains, which is sort of like ways of artificial writing at the word level. And I will start with an example drawn from the textual domain just to talk very quickly about generation. So this is a character-level recurrent neural network that's trained on about 23,000 recipes. And what people have done is fed these recipes into the neural network and then asked it, they've sampled from the network. And they've come up with this amazing set of recipes. This is incredibly delicious. I would encourage all of you, when you go home tonight, to think about Chinese meat or 2 of salad. The ingredients themselves should tell you what flavor experience you're going to be in for. But it may kill you. What's interesting about this is the network has learned the genre of a recipe. It has learned that recipes should have a title, and that it has a yield, and that ingredients exist, and ingredients have units. And then it has a narrative, right? Pour the sour cream into the egg coloring, drain the pans in a bowl, all these different things, beat in the eggs. Now, it's not just delicious food. You can also put in, for example, 176 Star Trek The Next Generation episode scripts, and then what you can do is sample from the network, and you will get an episode which is no more boring than most of Star Trek The Next Generation. This text network has learned that characters like Picard and Riker and Geordi exist. It has learned how that sometimes people wait a beat, that they continue, they move into spaces. Anybody can do this, you just need good sample data. And that takes us into the visual domain. So I've shown you some textual things, and I should just point out with these guys, these are not Markov chains. These are character-level models. It's not measuring how frequently a word comes after another word. It is measuring how often a character comes after another character, and that's very powerful. Generative adversarial networks, so visual stuff is more complicated than text, and so we need more power to deal with it. So what's more powerful than one network? 2 networks, like at least 100% more powerful than one network alone. But what would be really interesting is to put 2 networks against each other in kind of an adversarial relationship to generate something. And so that's what GANs do. That's what generative adversarial networks do. So consider 2 neural networks. One of them looks at tens of thousands of 19th century photographs and tries to dream up new photographs which conform to the genre, or more accurately, the distribution over data of these images. But that's not the only network at work. And in addition to the art forger, we've also got a detective who's looking at both the real photographs and the fake photographs and is trying to come up with a heuristic for what's real and what's not. Now, what's interesting about this is that each of the 2 networks that are set adversarially against each other learns from the other. So the forger learns to dream more accurately when his or its fake art is discovered by the detective, and the detective learns to be more discerning when the art forger gets an image through its heuristic. And this happens thousands and thousands of times a second, and we run these algorithms for days and days and days. And so what's kind of interesting about this is to think about, well, what does that actually mean in the real world? So let's take a look at this visualization. This is actually trained on about 20,000 faces from 19th century Americans. And what you're seeing is the two neural networks basically fighting each other over the definition of a face. You've got somebody who's forging faces of Americans who've never lived, and you've got a detective which is saying, this is not real, I caught you, or oh my gosh, I let one through, I better learn more about what a face is. And as this image progresses, you're going to see things that are uncanny. You may see things that are horrific. You're going to see things that are faces, things that aren't faces. But you're seeing this process of sampling from a network and trying to produce something new from that network, and then fighting against something which is trying to tell the real from the false. That's one particular effort we've done. I've also worked on the Swedish photographs you've seen earlier. I did about 30,000 faces from the collection in Lund. And here you see, the bottom right here, you've got like bad, like early on it's static, right? Because it's guessing, well, maybe this is a face, nope. The one in the good, in the late epoch, was just a way of saying it. I've let it run for 3 days. That's really good, like that's almost a human, right? And then the one on the far right is so good. They just screwed up the eye number, right? The network was like, well, maybe if 2 eyes are good, then maybe like 3 eyes are even better. And I hope my discriminator caught that one. Otherwise, we'd be in for a world of trouble. You'll sometimes see faces that seem to switch between genders, male facial hair patterns, young girls' hair up top. It's very confusing. You might see sailors' hats. That's because when people graduate from college in Sweden, they put on the sailor outfit. Anywho, that's that. What did we learn? Well, what did we learn from this? It's fascinating to me to see how an algorithm, which, remember, this is not like generating a face from, it is generating a face from first principles. It's generating a face from static. It's not like we've told it what eyes are. This is deep learning. It's not like the models of the 1990s. So how can it hallucinate that stuff? And of course, at least in the States, we're having a big conversation about deep fakes and the notion of truth and blah, blah, blah. So it's important for GLAM to be at that table. What questions did we have to confront? Well, in America, 19th century photography, especially that of popular culture, I guarantee you contains offensive imagery. I wrote this before the clusterfuck in Virginia, but those of you who've been following American politics know that blackface is not something restricted to like the 1870s, apparently it's the 1980s. But in all seriousness, I would not be comfortable having photographs of Caucasians in blackface serve as the source for this. That would be pretty awful. And then an obvious point is that I'm not confident who is in control of the dress, the figuration, the pose, the accessories of Native Americans in 19th century photographs, and I would not be comfortable using that material in very many of the experiments here today. This brings up ethical considerations. Data problems often let us think about archives and ethical problems in archives, the relationship between the photographed and the photographer, the constructedness and the contingency of identity. The 19th century stuff, of course, you're talking 15-second exposure times. People put on really nice clothes. This stuff is planned out. This is the construction of identity. This is not a slice of life. In the American context, I think the best work on stereotype and caricature that I've seen is a documentary film by the late filmographer Marlon Riggs, Ethnic Notions. I highly recommend that film to get some background on exactly the type of the tropes of the Sambo, the Uncle Tom, the Aunt Jemima, things like that. So we have to think about these things. I'd point to the work of Jackie warnimont, who's both worked on Native American photography and then returned to that work 7 years later to critique it. I think that work, it wasn't necessarily computational, it was digital, but she's very thoughtful in both modes. And then I think we, as cultural heritage workers, we have to think about what we will do and what we won't do. I think we have to appropriate and take from the private industry and tweak and twist those algorithms to serve our needs, not Google's needs. And I think we have to build up the expertise for machine vision within GLAM. I think that we have to do this work first, and then when we want to sit down with Google or Amazon or whatever and use their free credits, we can at least be better informed about it. I do think there are really exciting opportunities for machine vision cultural heritage that involve combining collections and thinking about them at this massive scale. As I showed you with that new version of PixPlot, where the curator will be able to select from this arbitrary visualization and sort of use his or her human insight to push that forward is important. And then finally, this last bullet point might be the most important thing I say today. I've been trashing these pre-trained models which think that slave shackles are jewelry. But we can change those models with transfer learning and with enough ground truth, with enough evidence from the GLAM sector of here are 10,000 images of XYZ and here are 4,000 images of something else. So we can retrain those last layers of the networks to produce a network which can effectively tell me that this is a Union officer or a Confederate soldier, that this is a woman in the performing arts circa 1870. The algorithms are out there and we have the data. With that, I'd just like to acknowledge my team from left, Doug Duhame, Kathy DeRose, me, and then Monica Ong-Reed, who we all work together in the Digital Humanities Lab. Thank you so much.
So we have some time for questions. Are there any questions for Peter? Oh, one in the middle there.
Hello. Is Pixplot open source, as in can any organization start playing with it?
Yes, great question. Everything we do is under the MIT license, except in cases where researchers have data that they want us to keep private or whatever. We definitely respect that, especially in the humanities. So if you look for Yale DH Lab on GitHub, I won't step away from the mic. You will find a code base there. Other people have run it. It is doable. It requires some. It's just a Python script, and it has installation scripts for the dependencies. And we certainly, if folks email me, this came up earlier for political reasons. I'm kind of off Twitter, but I love email. So if people would email me with any questions, I can get you guys in contact with our software engineers and designers. We have a partnership with the Smithsonian at Yale, and they're excited about doing this. So we certainly would love to work with folks down under as well.
Any other questions? We have time for another. Down the front here.
It's a really interesting way of bringing history to life and providing different analytics, 100 years on, 400 years on.
Yeah.
How do you see, we've done lots of work in digitising text from newspapers, from original manuscripts. We're doing stuff with stock exchange records that we hope to then link with other sources of information about social and cultural history. How do you see the frame will emerge that we can actually put those together to get, say, revelations about the treatment of Indigenous people in the 1870s or Chinese workers?
Right.
And so where were they? So you can see that the pictures were located, say, in Ballarat, because that's where the gold miners went.
Yeah. That's a great question. There's actually some terrific work in the Netherlands on historic newspapers and specifically putting together image and text and thinking. This particular researcher I'm thinking of works on Americanization, post-war Americanization in the Netherlands. So he has to look at Coca-Cola ads and car ads, and he has to look at the text too. I think there's some really interesting ways of combining image mining together with modern techniques in text mining, including vector space or word embedding models. The notion of a newspaper is, of course, really exciting because it is that mixed media, and there are things that we can interrogate twice. If you think about the state archives that are a part of the Real Face of White Australia, that's also a visual and a textual archive. I think that, and I also, as I've been sort of trashing description for just to prove a point about raster analysis, I think also in our collections saying, well, here are all the images which look like circles over here, but here are all the images which share a word in their description over here. So I think some of our visualization systems might be able to work just as well in textual signal as well as visual.
We do have time for one more question, if anyone has one. No? Oh, there is one. Okay.
Thank you. That's a really stimulating talk. You mentioned just at the end that the possibility for the GLAM sector to feed back to the big text.
Yeah.
How do you see that transfer learning actually working?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I think, the key for everyone is to think about a real-world use case. And one of the things, just from what I've seen in the 19th century, is if we could come up with classifiers for women in the performing arts, that if we had, you only need like 50 to 100 images of women that we know from real human experts, real historians, real archivists, real curators. These were opera singers. These were actors, female actors. 50, 100 images is enough to retrain the last layer in a lot of these networks, which make all these horrendous mistakes about jewelry and slave chains. So really, it's just a targeted project. There are some things that the algorithms can't see. I don't know if it would be able to distinguish really Union from Confederate in black and white pictures. If are the uniforms really different? We don't really know. But it's a fascinating experiment to think about what is sort of computable and what is visible. So I would say, especially in the cases where we have some well-curated collections with humans who know what they're doing, and then a great unread of like a big newspaper digitization of pictures without captions, or some of the photographic archives. I know that people in Australia have done terrific work with crowdsourcing, putting things on Flickr. We could think about this as just kind of an extension of that, and adding the algorithm in to say we're relatively confident that these are the 50 objects which really represent women in the performing arts in the 1870s. I think cultural heritage institutions should say, this XYZ library, ABC Museum, are producing this model, putting it out for free. We think it will tell you whether somebody's an opera singer or a female actor. And try it on your data. And you'll learn a lot from the cases where it gets it wrong. Some cases you'll never know if it gets it wrong because the historical record just isn't there. But I think in answer to your question, finding these small bite-sized use cases of being able to distinguish something from something else where there's enough ground truth to really retrain the layer, and then sort of making those models available as a kind of digital scholarly publication to say this XYZ museum's contribution, and we want to see how well it works in the real world.
Okay, so please join with me in thanking Peter for his presentation this afternoon.
Thanks so much.